Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ninth episode of the Translation Podcast. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome James Christie. James, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
It's a real pleasure. Daniela, good to see you.
Originally from London, James has always felt more European than British. He studied French and German at the Universities of Nottingham and Innsbruck, graduating with a degree in literature, linguistics, and translation. His career has taken him across France, Germany, Switzerland, Chile, and back to London, where after a stint at The Guardian, he completed a teaching English as a foreign language course and moved to the Indian Ocean island of La Réunion. As a translator and interpreter, he specializes in fields such as fisheries, sugarcane agronomy, regional cooperation, shark risk management, cyclone forecasting, and environmental conservation. He has interpreted at international conferences and for high-profile figures, including President Macron and Ahmed Kasrallah, the former inmate with Mandela. He also runs a language training center offering English coaching for businesses. Passionate about new challenges, he is a mountain trail runner, a devoted rugby fan, and a father of three. After 25 years in the Indian Ocean, he now splits his time between Réunion Island and Nantes. James, welcome. Firstly, can you share the story of how you transitioned from working at The Guardian in London to becoming a language professional in La Réunion?
Sure, with pleasure. It's quite a leap from Farringdon Road in London all the way to the Indian Ocean. I guess I was doing a job that I wasn't enjoying. I had great experience with languages, and I'd lived in France, as you said, and other countries. But I was doing this job where I wasn't using any of my language skills. I was trying to break into travel journalism, but after a year or so at The Guardian, I was neither writing nor traveling. So I said to myself, okay, James, you have to do something here. You have to take this upon yourself to make something of your life. And I kind of rolled the dice with Reunion Island. My housemates at the time, they were sick of me complaining about the rain and the bad weather. And they said, you should head off to the tropics. And I knew nothing about Reunion. This was in 2000. So this was pre-internet. Well, not pre-internet, but there wasn't anything online really about Reunion Island. And I bought a return ticket. It wasn't a one-way ticket, and arrived in Reunion and basically tried to start a new life in a new place with a new language and new culture and new people and a new hemisphere. Everything was new, but it worked well.
Amazing. And how did you decide for the Reunion Island? What piqued your interest there?
Okay, to give people some idea, Reunion is between Madagascar and Mauritius, so in the Southwest Indian Ocean. It's very small. It's about the size of Luxembourg. If you're from Europe, you would know what that means. If you're British, if you're not from Europe, it's about the size of the M25 motorway. And it's an overseas French department, which means that it has all the same rules and regulations as France. In fact, I shouldn't say it's the same rules and regulations. I should say it is France. You know, you arrive here by plane and there's a big sign that says, welcome to Europe. And here we are in the Indian Ocean. So France has a number of these overseas departments, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Mayotte, and of course, Réunion Island. Other countries also have these, what they are called, the European Union calls them outermost regions, the OMRs, such as the Azores, the Balearics, the Canaries. So I really wanted to go to a place where people spoke French, where the sun was shining, but where I would really be faced with a real life challenge. And once again, I say my original objective was only to stay for 6 months. And after the 6 months expired, I said to myself, well, what do I do? Well, I've already missed my plane. I may as well stay here for a bit longer. So, yes, it was essentially to, I think, surprise myself, certainly surprised my friends and family by coming here. But it was really case of challenging oneself. And I believe that we should all, if we can, do things that put us in not necessarily a tricky spot, but push us out of our comfort zones. It's so easy to stay at home. When I say home, I mean in our hometowns, and live our lives without really pushing the envelope. Yeah, and I don't know, was that similar for you?
Yes, definitely. And who doesn't want to live on an island and make a living? So live there permanently. So that is a great opportunity. But also, you're right, pushing ourselves to live in a different location. And being a digital nomad nowadays is much more accessible, even more after the pandemic. So a lot of people are thinking about changing location.
Mm-hmm.
James, what steps should someone take to research the market before making a move to an exotic destination? But in general, what should we do before we move somewhere?
I think it depends a lot on whether one is being a digital nomad to work in that new place, or one is simply continuing your job in a different place. For example, you may be an IT consultant and you've had enough of living in, I don't know, Berlin or whatever, and you decide to go and live somewhere else, but you do the same job. Obviously, the research there has got nothing to do with your career. So I can't really talk much about that. I think that's relatively simple. I think when it comes to relocating to do a job in that place, it's the choice of the place that has to be the most important. Because you could find somewhere that ticks all of the happiness boxes, but none of the professional boxes, and vice versa. There could be some wonderful places in the world professionally that might not float your boat. They might not tick your boxes in the happiness. I think, for example, of the Middle East, Dubai, for example. I've got lots of clients who go to Dubai regularly, and they say it's a great place, and they say, oh yeah, I think you'd find a lot of work. It's not my cup of tea. I need greenery, I need mountains, two things that are lacking, I think, in Dubai. So that's the first answer to your question. I think the second answer is quite obvious. It's about researching what you may find in that particular place. Earlier, you mentioned Chile. And yeah, I went to South America. I was there for a year. And I was able to find addresses and telephone numbers of, not websites because they didn't really have them then, of language schools in Santiago and Valparaiso. And so I called up all of these places. There are about 12, 15 of these places. Said, hello, I'm James. I'm coming to Chile. And they, all of them said, okay, thank you very much, but you're interesting. Your CV and profile is interesting, but there's no point really taking this conversation any further while you're still in London. Wait till you come and see us. But that first connection was so important, because then 3 months later, when I arrived in Santiago, I called them up and said, hello, I'm here. And they said, oh, great, can you come for an interview? I said, yep, I'm free today. So I did, I think, 4 or 5 job interviews on the first day in Santiago. It turned out that we didn't like the city. And that's where I said, well, let's go to Viña del Mar and Valparaiso. And things worked there. So the first city I went to didn't tick the happiness boxes, despite the mountains that they have there. But it did tick the professional boxes. The city where I ended up ticked both. You know, Valparaiso was a wonderful city, and I found work there. So I think when it comes to relocating, it's all about spending a lot of time working out where is best, because you may have a dream destination in your mind, anybody listening to this, but that might not be the best place for you. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. And I wanted to add an additional question on that, James, if I may. How did you make your entry on the market in La Réunion, in a location that was not familiar to you? You were, a foreigner. I'm curious about your experience, and if you have some tips to share with our audience.
Yeah, I think that's it wasn't easy. I spoke the language, as in I spoke French. I didn't speak Réunionnese Creole. So my first experience of Reunionese Creole was kind of, wow, I've read about this somewhere. Once again, I'm speaking from a pre-internet perspective. So the actual transition, I have an atypical background. So I am a conference interpreter and translator, but I didn't start that straight away. My focus was on English language tuition. And because I was a native speaker, doors opened immediately. Also, because I'd just been working at The Guardian, more doors opened as well. So that was actually very helpful. I think even today, there will be places in the world where you don't necessarily get native English speakers or native Spanish speakers or native French speakers going to places to use their language professionally. And we all know that if you want to give Spanish lessons, you're going to have a greater chance of doing that if Spanish is your native language. Now, I don't say that for everybody, because I have people on my team who speak perfect English, but it's their second language. So, but I think that's important to be wary of. If I had known that there were already 10, 15 people like me on the island, I would have had taken a different approach. I mean, we have 850,000 people here. But certainly when I came, I was only I would say less than 10 people of British origin who had been living on the island for a long time, and most of those were in working for the French education system. So it wasn't easy to fit in. The temperature, the distance, the administrative difficulties, which every person who comes to France will know. You come to the Indian Ocean, you can multiply that by 10. So it wasn't easy at the beginning, but it was really, Danielle, it was part of my kind of philosophy to life, which I will sum up in 3 words. It's dream, plan, and do. So I dreamt about Reunion, and I daydreamt as well, for a whole year before coming. It took me that long to actually get the guts to jump on the plane. The planning part and the doing part, some people think the hardest part is that 3rd step. It's the doing part. That's the easy part. That's just, but it's the planning that's hard. And I apply that to everything in life. If you've got a project to work on, you can dream about it. It's great fun, but you're never going to do the do part unless you do the planning part. And I discovered that the hardest part of my adventure to Reunion was telephoning a company and saying, "Can I have a ticket, please, to Réunion Island?" And as soon as I had that, I suddenly said to myself, "Oh, I've been waiting a whole year for that." So, it was a lot of things came together, and I discovered that I was maybe braver than I thought I was.
I love that. Being brave, being bold, dreaming and planning. I think planning is the key for sure. So thank you for sharing that, James. And going back to interpreting, you've interpreted in areas ranging from technical fields to high-level politics. I'm curious, how do you manage the switch in mindset between these very different fields, and if there are differences, technical differences in interpreting?
I think, and I'm sure people listening who are also conference interpreters might share the same opinion as myself. Irrespective of whether it's high profile or low profile, it remains language, it remains communication, and it remains doing your job. So I don't actually apply or see any real difference, whether it's interpreting for a small local community outreach group or interpreting for a high power, whatever, fisheries committee. What is something that requires a huge switch in mindset is the format. So if I'm doing simultaneous booth work for a music market or simultaneous booth work with a government agency, it's still simultaneous translation in the booth. So you put that mindset on. But suddenly, if somebody asks you to step out of the booth and come up on stage and do consecutive, whether it's for an EU commissioner, which was the case for me 3 weeks ago, or it's the case for a local charity, you're still up on stage, and that requires a complete shift in mindset. So to answer your question, it's all about the format and not necessarily about the technical. I don't know, do you agree with that? Do you have a similar experience in that kind of situation?
I would say yes. I think the quality of the interpreting doesn't really vary on the type of customer that you have. The setup can take big influence on it and how familiar you are. So in my conversations with different interpreters, but also in my experience, as you mentioned, you have to be bold and take the challenge and not, panic. And then the more experience you have, the less, pressured you feel. But you're right. I can completely relate to that. I used to work for NGOs. I, interpreted for high professional, high profile individuals or agencies, and I've never made a difference between them. It was more the setup, as you mentioned. I remember once I was called to interpret on stage, which it was, I've never done that before, and my heart was pounding. So I felt like it was so stressful, but I survived it, and I got better the next time.
We survive, we get through these things, and I think you're right, it's a question of familiarity. Like you, I have more experience in the booth than I have on stage doing consecutive. And I know colleagues who are the other way around, and they dread being asked to go into the booth. It's like, no. I know I don't have the skill set for this. I'm much happier doing the consecutive. So it's great because, you can work with somebody like that and be complementary. One person is stronger in the booth, and the other person is stronger up on stage. Because if we're working as a pair, they don't need two interpreters up on stage. They only need one.
Agreed. And speaking of which, James, my next question is related to that. I'm curious, how do you maintain accuracy under pressure in these settings? And can you give us a couple of examples of a situation where you were under a lot of pressure, but still, you pushed yourself to deliver?
Okay. How do I manage I think we all have our own little techniques. I can already hear my booth buddy. If she's watching this, she's probably laughing because she says, James, sometimes he gets a bit stressed. And I do, but never when my mic is on. That's obviously the golden rule. But I think there's only one thing that really bugs me, and I'm sure people will nod in agreement. When a speaker is speaking too quickly, this is something that we all have to deal with. And of course, we can ask that they can be asked by somebody to slow down. And that's as far as we can go in that. What annoys me is when they have been reminded or asked to slow down and then they don't. So in situations like that, I really have to close my eyes, blank everything out, and try to filter the information as much as possible. So it's not easy when somebody's hitting 160, 170, 180 words a minute. I have a little technique where I count, when my colleague is interpreting, I actually count the number of words in 20 seconds, just writing on a page, multiply that by 3, and it's useful information because if you're close to the speaker, when I say close, I mean you know them well, you can speak to them at the coffee break and say, listen, you were going a little bit fast. Some people will say, James, that's not your job. You're their interpreter. You can't say anything like that. So I think that's one area in which I find it challenging. Another area, and here's an example for you, is when we have to deal with accents. Now, it's all about, accents are not really that difficult if you know them. So here in the Indian Ocean, now I'm very accustomed to Mozambique, Tanzania, Madagascar, Seychelles, etc., French, South Africa, etc., whether they be English or French. But the first time you come across somebody from Thailand, China, Japan, the Philippines, it's a new set of vowel sounds, new set of consonant sounds that you have to get your head around very quickly. And there was one time, this was working for Météo France. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned the clients, but there we are. And there was a representative who had come to Réunion Island whose English was very good but exceptionally poor pronunciation. And most of the people in the room were listening to the French translation, even if people who spoke both languages would prefer to listen to us than listen to his English. And it was a situation where I said to myself, what do I do here? There are people who are missing out on the information because it was just too hard for them to follow. I'm talking about the English speakers from Africa who couldn't follow this person. And I made the decision to talk to one of the organizers and say, listen, just to let you know, there are participants who are having difficulties following this person's accent. And the reply was, are you criticizing the person's accent? And I suddenly thought, okay, I have overstepped the mark here. I said, I'm not criticizing, I just want you to be aware because I'm invested in this. I want this training program. It's very technical. It was all about cyclone forecasting. I want this to work well. I want the people from Tanzania, from Mozambique, to be able to get this information so that they can protect the people who, their populations when a cyclone comes. And if they're missing out on the information, at least you need to know about it. So that was one time where I tried to do something to let's say, manage that stressful situation. I remember, Daniel, a couple of examples. What was the word he used? Okay, here it is. See, if you were translating and you heard somebody speaking English and they used the word trococyclo. Trococyclo. What could that be? Any guesses? So the person was saying tropical cyclone.
Oh.
Now, given that was the subject of the 2-week seminar, you would have thought, yeah, I can see I rolled my eyes a lot that week, I can tell you. But they were all very nice about it, and they understood the situation. They said, I'm sorry, James, there's not a lot we can do about this. Well, there's nothing we can do about it. The other, to answer your other question, what else can I do about it? I don't know about you, but I do a lot of breathing, not heavy breathing, deep breathing exercises. And I won't necessarily only do this at the coffee break or at the end of the day. I will also do it when my colleague is working. So when he or she are translating, I will be doing some slow breathing exercises just to bring that level of tension back down. It's not necessarily going to do a huge amount of good, but it's not going to do any harm. Because you know what it's like sometimes when you've been going for 25, 30 minutes and a new speaker appears and your colleague might not be ready to take the hand over, you have to keep going. And sometimes that little bit of breathing helps you push on for another 5 minutes. Do you do something similar?
So I haven't interpreted in a while in a booth, but what did help me was for sure the breathing exercises, especially if you're a beginner and you feel like anxiety is, really rising up and you feel you can't really control your emotions. So definitely breathing exercises help. I actually have an episode with my friend Yulia Popescu, who's a psychotherapist, and I've asked her to come in and share some of the stress management techniques that interpreters can use, not only in the booth, but also under really stressful situations like, police interrogations or being in court, dealing with really sensitive content. So if you're listening, I'll definitely drop the link to that episode. And we did talk about breathing exercises. Yulia also talked about some anxiety exercises where you try to, really dissociate yourself from the content, or some being present exercises, being there, so not letting your mind slip away.
Well, and that would be very. So I was just going to say that would be very interesting to watch a video like that, because, as I said, I didn't do any formal studies in simultaneous interpreting. It's all just learned in the field, and I'd be very interested to hear about that, especially when it comes to talking about trauma and interpreter's trauma, PTSD, that kind of thing, which is an issue for some people.
That's right, and that leads me to the next question, James. When we prepared for this episode, we did talk about PTSD, and I haven't thought about things under that angle. So that was a big aha moment for me because we do talk about stress for interpreters, but we don't talk about PTSD, acoustic shock, and even insomnia. Could you walk us through how these issues manifest in interpreters' lives, in your life, if you have some examples, and why
Sure.
do you think they're not talked about more openly? And also why maybe there's an opportunity to capture them in interpreters training, being in the university or in other setups.
Okay, well, just to start by the end of your question, I think including it in university is a good idea, but you're never going to be able to recreate these difficult situations. You can only talk about them. And you mentioned a couple of different things. Okay, insomnia. No, I don't suffer from that myself. I certainly did the night before my first my first job, but I think that's something that affects many different professions, of course, millions of people, regardless of their jobs. As for the acoustic shock, I've had this before. For those who don't know, it's when you have a very sharp charge of sound into the ears, and the volume is just way over, and it actually affects you. It can affect your hearing quite severely for a long period of time, sometimes permanently. I've had it just once, and it's funny in hindsight, but it certainly wasn't funny at the time. Somebody came back from lunch, a new speaker. I put my headphones on, started listening, and the guy, to wake up the people, the audience, took the microphone and just shouted, "Ah!" It was his kind of a joke, and literally I just threw my headphones off. I was dizzy, and I had to, I didn't faint, but I went to, well, the ambulance people were there because it was one of those events, and I was taken care of for a while. Fortunately, I didn't have any long-lasting damage. But the big one, I think, that maybe people listening suffer from without realizing, is when we interpret for traumatic situations. People, as you say, in police situations or accident situations, crime, all kinds of things. And let's not forget that when we are simultaneously interpreting, we are not saying he or she, we are saying I. And when you do that over a number of hours, days, weeks, it has an effect on the subconscious for sure. The example that I've had was in Réunion Island. We have a problem related to shark bites. And there was a period between 2011 and 2019 where it was not safe to go into the water at all. Things have changed a lot since then. But there was a podcast, if people are interested, it's a really interesting podcast. It's called Shark Attack in Paradise. And while I was interpreting for that, I had to interpret for all of the people involved, not just the politicians and the scientists and the fishermen, but of course, people who had lost parts of their body and people who had lost family members. And when you are saying, and then the shark saw me, and the shark's eyes looked into my eyes, and then my leg disappeared in its mouth, it has a severe effect on you. Just so you know, my heart is beating right now at 160 because it's really, that experience encapsulated a childhood fear that I managed to get rid of when I came to Réunion. But since that project, I have not been back in the water, and that was 4 years. So you might say, God, this poor guy, he lives on a tropical island in the Indian Ocean and he can't go swimming. We have lagoons, fortunately, where the water is like 50 centimeters, well, less than 1 meter deep. But I think that the question of PTSD is something that should be addressed and should be spoken about more. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of people who might be listening thinking, do you know what, I think I went through something like that. Maybe not as bad as James, who can't go in the sea anymore. But maybe people who have been working with charities in war conflict zones, zones with famine. This is something that is going to have a huge long-lasting impact on the translator or interpreter. So, I mean, you asked the question, why don't we, did you say, why don't we talk about it more? Was that your question?
yeah, why don't we talk about it more, and what can we do to bring more awareness to this so that interpreters can understand that this is a problem, acknowledge it. I know, by the way, this is just a note, but I think that more and more interpreters in high stress situations or setups have started to talk with psychotherapists or hypnotherapists, or even try to open up to colleagues about it in an effort to overcome the situation. But I think, yes, it's a matter of awareness, but also what can we do about it?
I think it's as a profession, we are relatively limited in our team of colleagues. You know, I don't think there are many interpreters who regularly work with 50 other colleagues. You see what I mean? So I think that social media is a wonderful place to have these discussions. And I participate in a number of fora online. And often people ask questions related to the everyday experiences of being an interpreter. And I have seen a couple of questions asked online about PTSD. So I think that's the best place to talk about it, as well as with our colleagues, of course. But you know, we're going to be limited in numbers when we talk to our colleagues compared to talking to a whole community of like-minded professionals.
Absolutely, absolutely agreed. James, many of us faced with a difficult interpreting assignment prefer not to quote that client. Can you tell us more about your approach of saying yes to difficult things and how you navigate that successfully?
So you mean people say no because they don't want to do the job because it looks too sketchy?
Yes, or maybe they're not familiar with the field. Maybe it's a high stressful, high level type of job. Maybe it's for a very important client. Also, all sorts of situations. My focus is not necessarily on the type of the scenario, but how do we say yes? How do we get out of our comfort zone and we are more bold in approaching things?
I think the question is, it's a question of trying to ensure that the comfort zone is not left. So we can be contacted by a client and the situation looks pretty dodgy on paper. My policy is to say yes to everything unless I'm already taken, unless I'm busy that day. And the next step will be to, and I do this, it's actually included in all of my quotes. There's a line that says, a technical meeting to be held beforehand, cost $0. So I include this on my quote, and people say, what's that about? And I say, well, we actually need a formal meeting before the conference, so that what I'm doing is laying down the law to a certain extent, but that's not how I put it. I'm of course suggesting approaches and giving certain guidelines, and that is all about essentially making our lives, me and my colleague, easier in the booth. Can we have the documents as well in advance? Who is going to be managing the booth? Can I have their number? And essentially trying to not necessarily eliminate all obstacles, but at least be aware of what they are, to reduce the number of surprises. You mentioned earlier about being asked up on stage. I get that question asked well before. I said, I just want to be sure. You've got 7 people coming from the United States. This is happening next week. And I sent this email just a couple of days ago. Are you sure that these people will not be speaking? And the person says, well, why is that important? I said, it is important because if they are only listening, then we are only doing French to English. If they get up on stage, suddenly the 7 earpieces that you have are not going to be enough for everybody listening from English to French. And that means you're going to suddenly ask me in the middle of the conference, can you come up on stage and do consecutive? Now, if they tell me that beforehand, at least I can prepare myself mentally. So to answer your question, I think that's the best way to move forward. If you feel doubtful about a job, of course you shouldn't force yourself into doing it, and maybe there might be colleagues who know the subject better than you, and you think, well, maybe it would be better for them to do it instead of me. Or You could say to yourself, well, it's an interesting subject. I'm going to prepare and step up to the mark and do the job, pushing things outside the comfort zone, exactly as you said.
Absolutely. I'm curious, do you quote preparation time for the fields that you're not familiar with, for instance, or do you consider that as part of the job? I'm asking because I just had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a newer friend of mine who's a English to Russian interpreter, and I'm curious if you quote the preparation time for fields that you're not familiar with.
Definitely not. Definitely not for various reasons. Number one, I don't know about prices around the world, but I generally invoice 650 euros per day per interpreter in the booth. Some people would say, okay, that's fine. Some people say, oh, that's expensive. And I say, well, it actually does include all the hours of preparation. And it's not just the 8 hours that we are with you. It's potentially 8 hours or 16 or 24 hours before. And they say, oh, okay. The danger, Daniela, also is that if you invoice preparation time, what happens if you do a similar job with the same customer next year? Do you invoice it again? And after 10 years of becoming an expert, do you keep invoicing it? Do you see what I mean? So I would rather push it up. Maybe there are people listening saying, oh, James, you're not expensive enough. But that's the going rate in my particular region, let's say. So to answer your question, no, I don't invoice preparation time.
Excellent advice. Thanks for sharing, James. So going back to out of box thinking, can you talk to us about a few situations where you approach things creatively in terms of client acquisition, and how were you successful in getting the client you wanted?
Yes, I think this is something that all of us as freelancers can certainly do. Imagine, Daniela, I don't know, you have decided to go and live in, I don't know, Barcelona, and your language pair is Spanish and English, or Spanish and Romanian, or whatever, and your work is a bit slow. You can say to yourself, okay, how can I generate business for myself? And this is something that I thought of here in Réunion. It's a wonderful place for tourism, but it's not on the map. People don't know about Réunion Island. So I was talking to a client and I said, why don't you try and get somebody famous to come to the island? And he laughed and he said, like who? And I said, I don't know. Let's imagine a James Bond film being shot in Réunion Island. And he laughed at me and he said, okay, James, you go and get James Bond and then we'll talk about it. And I was thinking about it. I thought, well, if I can bring, obviously not Daniel Craig to Réunion, but if I could bring somebody in the industry to the island, that would give me potentially a week of work translating for that person, accompanying that person. So that night I went online and I just Googled, what was the film? Skyfall. And I found the name of the location scout on Skyfall. It turns out that he had also worked on Pirates of the Caribbean and World War Z. Googled him, found out that he was a surfer in Southwest England. A friend of mine is also a surfer in the southwest of England. I texted him and I said, do you know this guy? And he said, I do. Do you want his number? So I said, yes, please. And the next morning I went back to the client and I said, okay, I've got the location scout from Skyfall and he's ready to come to Réunion whenever you want. And the guy was like, are you serious? I said, well, no. And it took a while because obviously it's quite a crazy story. And the guy in England was thinking, well, this is a bit sketchy. It took me a year of really saying, come on, are you going to come? Are you going to come? A whole year. And he did come. And I got 7 days of interpreting out of it. And it was great fun. So that was one example. Another example was, you mentioned President Macron earlier. Something funny happened. So I received a request from l'Élysée saying, President Macron is coming to Réunion Island. We need interpreters, blah, 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 blah. And I said, sure, here's my quote. And 3 or 4 days later, they replied very politely saying, thank you, but no thank you. The president prefers to travel with his own, his own translators. And I thought about this. I thought, this is a bit unfair. We're trying to communicate a message of environmental protection. And here we are, he's traveling with interpreters when we already have interpreters at the destination. And there's a Réunionnese proverb, Daniela, which is "Nulle pas plus, nulle pas moins," which basically means, you know, we are not above you, but we are certainly not below you either. You know, it's a message of equality. And I put that on social media, and I said, the President Macron doesn't want local interpreters. You know, what's wrong with us Réunionnese? I can say that now after 25 years. And do you know what? Somebody saw my message on Facebook. And I'm not kidding. 2 hours later, I got a call from l'Élysée saying, we've changed our mind. We are going to go with you. So President Macron came to Réunion, did his conference. We did the interpreting, and it all went well. So it's a case of standing up for yourself, I think. So you mentioned creativity. I think for the first example, I was certainly being creative. And this is something that, as I said, you could do in Barcelona. You could say, you know, what would be interesting for a potential client? And you can try and source that and bring that person to the place where you are. It's all about using contacts as well, I think. I was lucky, it was just a pure coincidence that I happened to have a friend of a friend. But, you know, in today's world of social media, you'd be surprised how few steps you need to get to somebody you want to talk to, whether they be a sports person or a politician. Sometimes it's doable.
Absolutely. Being bold, not being afraid, you know, pushing the limit, using social media nowadays can do wonders. And speaking of stories, James, would you like to tell us how you turned rugby from a passion into an interpreting job?
Definitely, with pleasure. I think I don't know about you, but I'm sure a lot of people watching don't necessarily get 100% of their income from translation alone or from interpreting alone. And I'm one of these people who do the slasher life. So I have coaching. I run a business English school, in interpreting translation. But I also branched out in other projects, fixing for films, podcast, negotiations, things like that. But then I thought to myself, well, what do you love most in life? And it happens to be rugby. And I said to myself, well, why not try to teach French to English-speaking rugby players in France? Because there are a lot of them. And my friends and my family were like, James, what is this harebrained scheme? It's never going to work. But I paid the money. I got a really professional video done, just a 2-minute thing that's on YouTube. And I started sharing it on social media. Nothing really happened. Then I thought, let's forget social media and make a few calls. I called somebody. Do you know this person? Sure. Can I have his number? Sure. Do you know this person? And I managed to go up and up and up to find a lowly sports commentator. And he said, well, listen, here are some email addresses of some coaches in France. And I contacted them, and one of them called me back. Well, replied to my email. And it happens to be the coach. He's a man called Stuart Lancaster, and he was the former coach of the England rugby team. And up until recently, he was the head coach of Paris. So this is a team called the Racing 92. And I have been teaching him in French ever since July of last year. And it's not just standard French, it's rugby French. We talk about rugby in French all the time. And I love it to bits. And I get the impression that we are teaching each other, because this is a man who's got huge experience and leadership skills and teaching skills as well. So it's a real reciprocal relationship. The next step was to try to find other players. And I was also teaching a man called Owen Farrell, who was the England captain. So this would be like, again, let's go to Spain. Imagine somebody wants to teach Kylian Mbappe Spanish. That's basically what I'm doing, but in rugby and in French. So I think, why am I sharing that story with you? I think it's just to show that we can have these dreams, we can have these ideas, and they don't have to stay ideas. It may be that I only have 2 clients in rugby French for the rest of my life. But that doesn't matter. It's a project. I tried it and it worked. And there are lots of projects that I have tried that haven't worked. So I think it's all about dreaming. I'm a bit of a dreamer, and planning, and of course the doing, as I said before.
I love it. And sports is such a specialized field and a niche that once you get in, you start getting recommended. I had the opportunity to be approached for Euro 2020. And believe me, I don't know anything about football terminology. And I love
Mhm.
that project so much. My husband adored it. So I was asking him, how do you say this in Romanian, or how, and so on. Then I started to get jobs from there, and I loved it. This is how we learn new things, and this is how we get in.
That's excellent. So have you done more football related jobs?
Yes, I have actually.
Oh,
Yes.
fantastic. Fantastic. That's a, but it's interesting because whether it be rugby or fisheries or coral reef conservation, we are always beginners at some point. So there shouldn't be a subject that we shy away from. It's all about, okay, I don't know it's today, but I will learn and I will know it's tomorrow. So whether it be football or anything, I don't think we should necessarily turn down a job because we don't know it well enough. Maybe if we don't like it and we're not interested, or politically it doesn't align with our opinions, you could certainly say no to it. But that's great. I love your Euro 2020 story. That's great. So you were interpreting for the Romanian footballers?
The other way around. I was interpreting from English into Romanian.
Excellent, excellent,
Yeah,
excellent.
and speaking of client acquisition, James, this is top of mind. Has always been top of mind. Will be forever top of mind for interpreters and translators. What advice would you give to translators and interpreters looking to improve their chances of securing contracts, especially in today's climate where everybody's trying to push prices down, thinking that
Mm.
AI is really helping us in our jobs, but also when competition for work is fiercer than ever.
That's a tricky question. I think it's on most people's lips. How do you stand above the rest? My first reaction that I say to everybody who answers that is not to bring down the prices. We have value to our work. There is AI arriving in lots of different domains, and we don't see them bringing their prices down. Look at the airplanes; they all run on computers, but the prices are not coming down of the tickets. Okay, that's maybe not the best comparison, but I think so. That's my first response. Second response is just to be super, super friendly with everyone you talk to. And I don't mean this in a manipulative way. If you're not a friendly person, it's not going to work. But to be open and chatty, I'm a great believer in using people's first names. So if I receive an email from someone and it's a call for tender, I will almost always reply within, and you might be surprised, but it's true, within 10 minutes, I will have replied. Even if they want a whole program and a complicated quote, I'll just reply with a quick, hello, Jean-Pierre. Many thanks for the email. I just had a quick question, and sometimes I'll just invent a question because it's just a way to not to get your foot in the door, but to create a connection with that person. And the person will either reply because they are nice, or they will reply because they won't reply because they're not allowed to. In a situation like that, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the job. 2 weeks later, they may reply saying, "Thank you, James. This is Jean-Pierre. Unfortunately, we haven't chosen you for this job. See you around." And then you reply with saying, "Thanks, Jean-Pierre. I really appreciated your email. It was nice to let me know. Don't hesitate to look me up the next time." And I think the more that we do that, the more likely people will go, "What about that guy, that James guy? He was had a good profile and he was reactive. Let's look him up again." Of course, if I keep putting my price where it is and other people are undercutting, then I'm not going to get the work. But at the same time, do we want to undersell? Do we want to negatively impact our revenue just for the sake of getting work? I will do discounts to people who I have a very close affinity with, or even friendship, whether that's professional or personal. But no, that's it's being friendly, it's being open, and also I think it's not just with our own, not just with the clients, but also with our own colleagues. There was one, there's a conference which I do every year, fisheries conference, and it's dotted around the Indian Ocean. And previously it was the client who paid me, and then suddenly it transitioned, and it was the French Ministry of Agriculture. So this is going back to Paris, and I sent them my quote, and they said, well, sorry, we can't actually work with you because we have a framework agreement with a translation agency in Paris. So we have to use these people. So I could have said, okay, fine, get stuffed. But I contacted the agency and I said, listen, my name's James. I've been working with this client for 5 years. I wanted to offer my glossary to your interpreters because they will need it. It's hours and hours and hours of preparation. So this was the COVID year, so 2020. So it's pre-AI. So and they said, are you sure? And I said, yeah, of course. And I wasn't doing it out of any, certainly there was no manipulation. I put myself in the position of the interpreters thinking, wow, if somebody's just going to throw their glossary at me with all these technical terms and be happy to have a 15-minute conversation about the client, that's just gold dust. Of course, at the same time, I was saying to myself, well, if I scratch their back, maybe one day, who knows, they'll scratch mine. And that's what happened. A year later, the client had said to the agency, listen, we have to work with you because we have no choice, but is it possible to have James Christie as a translator? And they said, definitely, yes, with no problem at all. And then the year after that, it shifted back to just me. So there's no agency anymore. And I think what did they say? It costs nothing to be friendly. And I believe in that.
I totally agree.
Whether that transforms one's business, I've got no idea. You tell me.
People buy people. I think that at the end of the day, being approachable, being friendly takes you a really long way. I also resonated with the fact that you said, you have to know your value. If you continue to push your prices down because the market behaves like that, or because you think that the market behaves like that, is in everybody's detriment. I also resonated with networking, right? So being where your clients are, so that they can see you, or use social media or LinkedIn or your website to get closer to them, so that they can see you either on video, or as you mentioned, to jump on a call and use your contacts. So absolutely. I wanted to switch gears, James, to your projects, your Anglophone projects in La Réunion. What are some memorable experiences where your linguistic and cultural expertise made a significant impact?
I think it's difficult to answer, because I think the people who will be interested in my response are the people on Reunion Island, because it's very specific to Reunion. People who are listening who might not really care. But I think there are some projects. The fact that I was the first person to open a private English language school on the island, what was that, 20 years ago, certainly helped. I also wrote an article in the local newspaper in the kids section, James's Corner it was called, for 10 years. So I think a lot of people benefited from that. I think to answer your question, all the stuff that I do, the different projects, it's all about raising awareness about the English language and to keep that at the forefront of people's minds whenever they see something pop up. Because in France, the level of English, as we know, is not as good as it could be. It's not as good as it should be, and it's not through any lack of skill or competence. It's just through the way it is taught. And I'm certainly not pointing the finger at the teachers. I'm pointing the finger at a system that doesn't want to create level-based classrooms. And as we know, there's no private language school on the planet who mixes levels when they teach English, but every single French school mixes levels. So I think it's all about ensuring that English is at the forefront of people's minds, whether it's my cinema evening projects, where we watch a film in English and have a drink afterwards, And that's something that I think native speakers around the world, you can do that. You could go to your local cinema. I don't know, let's imagine a French speaker who is based in Boston, I'm inventing, and there will be cinemas that show French movies, and you can organize French nights. It's a little bit of revenue. It's great for networking. That's where I met my wife, one of those evenings. So other projects, and I would encourage everybody to Google the next word I'm about to give you. It's called MAF. Just Google it and imagine me working there, or imagine you working there. It's in the heart of Réunion Island, up in the mountains, in what we call a cirque. It's this huge caldera of subsided volcanic rock. And I have a project where I go to this place and I teach the tourism professionals English. And I remember one day I had to run under a waterfall along the footpath. And I was thinking, wow, this is not London. This is not London at all. And it was one of those moments where I thought, okay, this is much better than being on the Metropolitan line in Farringdon Road at the Guardian. I'm running to work under a waterfall. So that project is hugely important, as is all tourism in Reunion. And I think to really answer your question in a nutshell, it's been a case of becoming a kind of Mr. English on the island, and that when people see me or hear stuff that I post on, that I say or post online, people are reminded not of me but of English, and that's what I want, because we've got such potential on this island. But one thing that is missing is English, and I can't do it all on my own. Fortunately, there are lots of other wonderful colleagues already in Reunion teaching, just like me, coaching, and we are getting there slowly but surely.
I love that. You're also a language coach, James, and I'm curious because we talked about interpreting, translation, language teaching, but also coaching. You're also a project facilitator, so it must be really demanding. And how do you balance these responsibilities? And what strategies keep you effective across disciplines?
I think, honestly, Daniela, I really consider myself hugely lucky in that these three activities. So my business is called CIT, coaching, interpreting, translating. And I'm so lucky because if you look at those three different jobs, the third one, translating, can be done in the morning, at night, at the weekends. The coaching stuff is done during the week, and I have a lot of online lessons, obviously 9 to 5, that kind of vibe. And as soon as I have a conference, I simply say to my students, I'm not available on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. Can we shift to Friday? And they will say yes. And if they say no, I say, well, don't worry, one of my team will replace me on the Tuesday. So I'm so lucky because it means I can juggle these three businesses. Timing wise, of course, sometimes you get a kind of a backlog where you've got, this is actually the case for me. I've got a 3-day conference next week, and I've also got a film to finish translating. And I said to myself, if I wait until Wednesday to start this, then it's just not going to work. So I'm very disciplined. And the question you said was, how do I manage that? I'm very, very disciplined, and it's all about lists. I'm a list geek, one after the other, 2 lists a day. And it helps me to do things on time. So there's stuff on my list here that is for July, but I write it every day. And when it's done, I cross it off, and I know that the next day it doesn't have to be repeated. So that's, I think, the only way of making sure I don't forget stuff. You know, as you see, I'm getting a bit old, so if I don't write things down, I'm just gonna forget things. So yeah, I think balancing the responsibilities is not impossible. It's not easy. I'm also very lucky to have a great team of coaches. So hello, Sean and Karen and Pauline and Kobe, who work with me. And it means that if I do have a long conference, which is the case 2 or 3 times a year, then my team will step in and take over.
I love that. When we prepared for this episode, James, we talked about setting industry standards. And given your involvement in these discussions around working standards in the translation and interpreting field, I wanted to ask you, what are your views on the development and implementation of interpreting standards? We did briefly touched upon these when we talked about, different settings. How do we prepare the speakers? How do we prepare ourselves? But would you like to talk to us more about imposing industry standards and how do we do that?
Well, I think the industry standards will vary from place to place. I've heard stories of interpreters who are so strict that when their allotted time is up, they turn off the mic, they stand up and they go home, which I'm sure is not common. I'm sure that probably happened once. It may even be an urban myth. But obviously, we are not going to apply things to the letter like that. However, if a conference, and you know what it's like, conferences are hard work. If we hit 5 o'clock, and we are due to be there until 5 o'clock, we start to think, when's this going to finish? And if you haven't had the conversation beforehand, you're lost, because the organizers may go on for another hour and for another hour, and it's really difficult to say after that, well, I'm going to invoice you more, because they'll say, wait, you didn't say. So it's all about having that conversation before. And I say to people, listen, I'm really happy to go over 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, fine, not 31. Do you see what I mean? And it's written on the on my quote as well, heures supplémentaires. That's what I will do with some customers. With other customers, I will say, if you want to go over, that's fine, but ask us before. You're going to go over, so ask us before. Because sometimes they say, no, it's definitely not going to go over. No. And then suddenly they realize they've got 15 speakers to cram into the last 2 hours. And you said, this is definitely going to run over. So in terms of imposing that, I'm very strict is the word. When it comes to sound quality, also, my colleague will laugh as she hears this, because she's like, oh, no, this sounds fine. It's like, Pauline, your ears are so much better than mine. You've got a younger set of ears. And I will really take the time to work with the sound guys. And it's something we haven't spoken about as interpreters. I think it's absolutely vital to have a really, really good working relationship with the sound technicians, because you may not see them ever again. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be nice and cordial, and they are in charge with their technical skills. Without the sound team, we're screwed. So I think I'm very strict on the sound checks and making sure everything is up and running, and to have a line of communication open with the sound people, so that if there is somebody who isn't speaking close enough to the mic, or if there's somebody who's forgotten to turn their mic off, this can be sorted out immediately. So is that what you meant when you spoke about the standards? Was it the conditions that you were referring to?
Yes, the conditions, and also the preparation time, or the discipline in the speaker's discourse, which is a total different beast, and we touched upon that. So it's a lot of things. And I think when organizers who are not familiar in hiring interpreters or different speakers approaching you, they might not know what it entails, right? So they think, well, they just put their headphones on and that's it.
Yes, there was one time where I arrived and the booth had been put in the wings. It was on stage and we were in the wings looking so perpendicular at the stage. And there was a huge screen behind the speakers, which we couldn't see. And I said to the organizers, we can't see the screen. And the person said to me, oh, do you need to see the screen? And I just replied and said, do the people in the audience need to see the screen? She said, yes, of course. Exactly. If they need to, then of course we need to. I said, well, what's the solution? I said, well, we've got this was a few years ago. That's the kind of mistake that I wouldn't make now. I wouldn't allow that to happen. And I said, well, listen, I was talking to the sound team and I said, listen, do you have a monitor? Can you connect the PowerPoint presentations, put them into a monitor, stick the monitor in the booth? And it was done in 10 minutes. But that's also a case of being bold. Many people, I think, will say, okay, I will manage. And I don't like that sentence, I will manage, because it means that whether you're an interpreter, translator, or any job in the world, somebody saying, oh, I will manage, it means that they are having to do a job that has been made harder through the mismanagement or potentially incompetence of other people. I don't think that's fair. So sometimes it's always important to say, can we find a solution to this? Maybe the answer is no. So what? Et alors? Maybe the answer is yes. So, and what you mentioned there, Danny, is really important. A lot of customers, clients, they don't know. Maybe it's their first time. There was one time recently where somebody wanted an interpreter for 1 month. And it was the local job center who got in contact with me. And I said, oh, just out of curiosity, what's the pay for this? And they said, it'll be €13.55 per hour. And I said, I don't think this is going to work. And they had never worked with a translator or interpreter before. So, and they said, so how much do you charge per day? 650. And they said, okay, I'll just check with the client. The client didn't come back, so they didn't have the budget. So then that does sometimes happen, and I know people who will give a discount because they want to support the project, and that's fair enough. If I can, I will. But if it would be silly of me to cancel a week of teaching and suddenly make 20% of what I would have made that week by working on a project for free, So yeah, it sounds a bit mercenary, but I'm a businessman,
Absolutely. We sell our time and we sell our skills and we sell our brain.
We do.
We have to be diligent about that. James, shall we finish this episode with a bang? Will you tell us the story? Will you tell us the story of how you met Julia Roberts?
Julia Roberts. Yes, with pleasure. Okay. So Reunion Island wasn't the first place that I parachuted myself into. And Chile was not the first place either. The first place was actually Paris. I just turned 18 and I decided to go to Paris to seek my fortune, like Dick Whittington. The streets were not paved with gold, and I ended up selling ice cream. That was my job. I was an ice cream seller in a very posh restaurant on the Champs-Élysées, Häagen-Dazs, with a very good friend of mine. And one day, the boss said, James, I think you're ready to leave the kitchens and go and serve your first customer. Well, okay, fine. So I walked up with my little notepad, and the boss had said, yeah, they speak English. You'll be fine. I think that's why he asked me to do it, because he didn't speak English. And I walked up to the table, and there was Julia Roberts. There she was. And she ordered one bowl of honey vanilla, and she left a tip. Can you guess what the tip was? How much money do you think she left me? And we're going out with a bang here.
Okay, 100 euros.
It was 20 centimes in old francs. This was before the euro, huh? So it was, I don't think she'd used the franc before. So that was a great experience, and it was I fell in love with France during my year in Paris, and then I ended up living in Béziers and Toulouse and Montpellier and Nantes as well. As you said at the beginning, I spent a lot of time in Nantes. So my heart is torn between Réunion Island and the cloudy, rainy skies of Loire-Atlantique.
I love that. And, having Julia Roberts as your first client is really setting the bar high for client acquisition. So now it all starts to make sense to me.
Exactly.
James, this was truly a pleasure to talk to you today. It was a really inspiring conversation. I was taking notes as you were speaking. I'm really impressed with your experience. I love your personality and I love your approach in client acquisition. I don't imagine someone not wanting to work with you. So that is that. I really resonated with how we talked about, being bold, especially in this climate where everybody is a little bit, stressed with AI and maybe, stressed with the prices that are kind of being hanged upon, our heads. Trusting ourselves and expanding constantly the portfolio. So this was a special episode. Thank you, James, for joining today. I will pop all your links in the video description for our audience to check your profile, your wonderful website, and connect with you on social media. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Also to you, Danielle. It's been a real privilege, and this podcast program is really interesting, and I encourage anybody watching it to subscribe and don't miss it. Don't miss a trick. It's really, really great what you're doing. So thanks to you.
Absolutely. You heard James, everybody. So please like, subscribe, and share the episodes, and let's grow the community.